Good evening. I'm delighted to introduce to you our keynote lecturer for this evening. Janneke Adema is a research fellow at the Center for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University. In her research, she explores the future of scholarly communications and experimental forms of knowledge production, where her work incorporates processual and performative publishing, radical open access, scholarly poetics, media studies, book history, cultural studies, and critical theory. She explores these issues in depth in her various publications, but also by supporting a variety of scholarly-led, non-for-profit publishing projects, including the Radical Open Access Collective, which we've heard about earlier today. Janneke wrote her PhD on knowledge production beyond the book, performing the scholarly monograph in contemporary digital culture. And this book is actually openly produced, processual and version PhD thesis, open to reuse and remix. Her current book project is on living books, experiments in the post-humanities. And related to her recent book project, her talk entitled The Digital Humanities Beyond the Digital and the Human, Imagining New Relationalities for Knowledge Production, addresses some of the conceptual questions digital humanities poses for how we do scholarship. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk, and thanks for being here in Beirut.
Just testing out, that's not working. Oh. Oh, not going free. Otherwise you can use that one. It's like a... Oh, got it? Yes. Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Wait. Let me readjust that slightly. Hello? Perfect? Yes, fantastic. So yeah, many thanks also for Maaike and for Ines for inviting me and for hanging out with me actually based on the last 2 days. It was really nice. And yeah, it's a great opportunity to speak here at Digital Humanities Institute Beirut. And I think it's been a really inspiring 2 days, and I hope my talk will contribute to the kind of ongoing discussions. So, as I've outlined in my abstract, in this talk I want to address some of the conceptual questions that the digital humanities poses for how we do scholarship, in particular in relation to scholarly knowledge production and publishing. So the ideas and projects I present here have been developed in collaboration with my colleagues at the Center for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University, and with collaborators in various networks and collectives, including the Radical Open Access Collective, which I will also discuss later on. So the text for this talk is built up out of reworked extracts of the article I co-wrote together with Gary Hall, which you can see here, mixed up with what Maaike already said, with material from a forthcoming book which I've been working on, which is entitled Living Books. So I want to start with some perhaps bold position takings about the digital humanities, and this is not to be contrary or to be difficult, but it's a kind of a motivation also to myself to remain critical and to explore potential alternatives, including what I would like to put forward as a critical and affirmative post-humanities. Now, in the second half of my talk, I will then explore some examples of what such a post-humanities could entail through an exploration of, first of all, alternative forms of publication, and second of all, alternative forms of organizing, community building, and infrastructuring around publishing and research. So as part of this, I will discuss my experience with a selection of open digital publishing projects that I've been previously involved in. So to start off my talk, I want to put forward that as fields, both the humanities and the digital humanities have not been really critically engaging in a meaningful way with the underlying humanistic aspects of the humanities, nor have they been critically exploring or questioning or even reimagining the concept of the digital, the computational, or the algorithmic, and its consequences for society at large, or more close to home, for how we do practice and theory within both the humanities and the digital humanities. Both the humanities and the digital humanities overemphasize the human subject. So humanities in its investing of authority and trust in the individual scholarly author, for example, and digital humanities with its focus on and creation of data subjects, of quantified and abstract cells which are analyzed through data modelings and visualizations, which then in turn are perceived as like objective forms of authority. So digital humanities in this respect stays too much within the boundaries and limitations of the humanities, showing insufficient appreciation for how digital technologies are involved in the decentering of the human in knowledge production. So both the humanities and the digital humanities tend to uphold these binaries between thinking and making, between theory and practice, without giving due consideration to the fact that they are always connected and entangled. So digital humanities, as reflected in a kind of maker discourse, has a blind spot for its own theoretical implications, even when renouncing theory or positioning itself as post-critical. Where humanities as a field has displayed a blind spot for its own research practices, especially with respect to the political economy of scholarly publishing and the material aspects of doing research. So we've talked about this before, a difference tends to be maintained in digital humanities between computing and the digital on the one hand and the humanistic and the human on the other. They're almost kind of seen as separate entities and they're just interacting. We're not kind of thinking them through. So I don't really want to focus too much here on these kind of critiques of hegemonic discourses within the digital humanities or in the humanities, which I think they have already been extensively debated and nuanced. And I also do not want to foreclose on the kind of critical potential of either the digital humanities or the humanities. So instead I want to focus on how I and my colleagues envision a kind of critical digital humanities as an affirmative and performative post-humanities. So for us, a critical digital humanities then asks, what are the implications of the decentering of the human and the rise of digital technologies for the humanities, for theory, for how we practice the digital humanities, for how we create, perform, disseminate, and access it? So together with colleagues and collaborators, many of which practitioner theorists or involved in practice-based research, we've been experimenting with these questions mainly by focusing on our own practices as academics and by affirmatively disrupting aspects of the humanities and digital humanities that we have taken for granted. So this involves questioning, critiquing, and performatively exploring other forms of authority beyond the rational liberal human subject, which is also commonly conceived as white, male, and Western, and associated concepts of the author, the book, originality, and copyright that we have inherited with it. And this also includes consideration for other forms of non-humanistic agency, decentering both the humanist data subject and the author God. So the rise of new digital technologies presents us, then, we feel, with an opportunity to re-examine and reinvent our ideas of the humanities and the human, as well as the digital. Now, just as a bit of background, what we then perceive to be as a post-humanities, that it's not like a singular theory or a method or a condition. It's not an era, it's not something that comes after the humanities or something that distances itself from the humanities or the digital humanities as they currently exist or are developing. So it's not post as in after. And it's also not, I think someone asked yesterday, it's not an either-or question. It's not that either humanities or the post-humanities, or that the post-humanities are taking over in some sense. So the post-humanities should be envisioned more as a kind of mutation or an intensification of elements, of dynamics and potentials that are already present in the humanities. So the history of the humanities already provides potential for radical self-critique. So a kind of inherent post-humanities has always already been a part of humanities' proclaimed otherness in this sense. So post-humanities then questions the humanities' humanist legacy in an ongoing manner. It explores the underlying humanist legacies within our performance of scholarship and how we can critically engage with these from a post-humanities perspective. So it relates directly to theories and discourses around the post-human and post-humanism, as part of which the human's boundaries with technology, the animal, and the environment have been eroded. And then it asks, like, how does this theorizing around the post-human affect the practice of the humanities today? So as we argue, the decentering of the human provides us with opportunity to raise the kind of questions for the humanities and for knowledge production, which we really should have raised all along, including these questions about the human subject and the fixed and closed book object, which continue to underlie and have so much power and authority in the present-day humanities. Yet as we argue, not only our ways of thinking about the world and the humanities must change from such a critical post-humanist perspective. It means that our ways of being and doing in the world must change too. So for us then, post-humanities, beyond the critical reflection on the concepts and thinking that structure the humanities, really explores doing scholarship. It focuses on what a post-humanist praxis or performance of scholarship might entail. So this is what myself and others have examined ways of being and operating differently in our work as practitioners theorists. By exploring, among others, forms of experimental publishing, so think about hybrid, enhanced, remixed, and multimodal, iterative and living web text and post-digital works. But also alternative forms of distribution, from piracy to peer-to-peer file sharing, radical open access, wikis, distributed networks, and post-digital print. But also distributed authorship practices, from collaborative to anonymous, including personas, aliases, pseudonyms, as well as machinic, automatic, generative, and algorithmic authorship. So as such, we're affirmatively disrupting the humanities in order to create a space for the invention of radically different, but not dialectically opposed post-humanity systems for the creation, performance, circulation, and ownership of theory. So if we want to perform the book differently then, in a way that does indeed take on board the lessons of these kind of post-humanities position or theory, in the sense that we accept that the book is a heterogeneous assemblage of humans, of threes, of discourse, of technologies, and all other kinds of inorganic elements, then we need to reconsider all those ideas we have inherited with the book. Especially since our current heavily print-based forms and practice of scholarly communication are increasingly problematic in the humanities. The present arrangements tend to sustain the interests of established stakeholders, for example, publishers and universities, which is inhibiting wider access to scholarly research and experimentation with new forms of scholarship. And I want to emphasize that these can be non-digital forms too, so I'm not like dissing the print, it's just the print-based discourses that I have a problem with. So who then is currently experimenting with the book in these ways, and why? Now, think, for example, of scholars who want to change the way quality is established through experiments with new forms of open peer review, or academics who want to critique the myth of single individual authorship by exploring forms of collaborative and anonymous authorship, or who want to question the commodification of the book by exploring gift economies and the opening up of the book through forms of radical open access, or who want to explore the fixity of the book through experiments with reuse and the remixing of material, or want to critique the objectification and bound nature of the book by working with processual works, with liquidity and versionings. And I think that most of all I'm interested in scholars who see the book as lying at the basis of our systems of knowledge production in the humanities, and for who then changing, rethinking, and reimagining the book is seen as an important and perhaps even essential step towards reimagining a different, perhaps more ethical humanities, albeit one that is messy and processual, contingent, unbound, and unfinished. Now, before I discuss two of the projects that I've been involved in more in depth, namely Living Books About Life project and the Disruptive Journal of Media Praxis, I want to briefly discuss one of the concepts or practices that underlies both of these projects, namely versioning. Now, versioning, as it has come to be used within academic research and publishing, refers to the frequent updating, rewriting, or modification of academic material that has been published in a formal or informal way. As a practice, it has been adopted from software development, where it is used to distinguish the various installments of a piece of software. But versioning is also a common feature of many web-based publication forms, from blogs to wikis, based on the potential to quickly revise and save a piece of written material. And although adapted from software development, versioning has been around for a long time and can even be seen as an essential aspect of writing, so including as a principle underlying word processes. But also of publishing, see for example Victorian serial publications, and scholarly communication more in particular. So think about the practice within the sciences and increasingly in the humanities to publish preprints and postprints, but also online first versions, versions of records, revised editions, etc. And even at earlier research stages, including discussions on mailing lists, working papers, and conference presentations, these can also be regarded as different renditions of an academic publication in progress, reflecting various stages of its development. Now, to reflect on this praxis, I would like to point out two things in particular. The first is the idea of the materiality of the different versions, which becomes important if we look at scholarship in particular, as the way that research is versioned is hardly neutral. So there remains a clear difference between a text published in a blog post and a text published as a printed monograph, even if the text or content remains exactly the same. In this sense, it's useful to explore the concept of the differential text, which is coined by the poetry critic Marjorie Perloff. Now, Perloff has called differential texts, and I quote, texts that exist in different material forms with no single version being the definitive one, End of quote. So this notion of a differential text becomes ever so important in an environment in which even our so-called fixed published objects, our articles or monographs, exist in different material versions sitting alongside versions in other media, from paper and hardbacks to PDFs, HTML, EPUBs, and digital interactive versions. Now, these different versions all have a different impact and ask questions about the agency of print and of the various other digital platforms and software that we use, where the various multimodal remix iterations of our publications will also be differently received and interacted with by readers. But the kind of real publication here becomes hard to determine, where it stresses the differences between each medium's materiality. So at the moment, when it comes to the publications of books in the humanities, for example, a clear cultural fetish for the printed object, for seeing our books published in print, continues to prevail. So the second aspect I would like to highlight here is the linearity that the concept and practice of versioning brings with it, where often versions are even numbered sequentially. So there's the idea of an endpoint here, of the final publication, and its further adaptations from that point. Now, within processual publishing, issues of linearity and registration of research claims remain important, where the idea of versioning turns things into kind of objects again along the way. So think of editions, for example, and encourages us to focus on their linear development instead of focusing on, for example, the various relationalities that publishing weaves. As we know, research often doesn't develop linearly, where versions or parts of versions get abandoned, taken up in different contexts, and they get remixed and remediated in different forms and media, mashed up with other projects and within different contexts and communities, where we often also return to previous versions and pick up from there. So this kind of idea that there has been a logical linear development to a piece of scholarship developed by a single author is one that we often construct in retrospect, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the actual practice of doing research. Now, the concept of iteration might be more useful to consider in this context, where it kind of offers the possibility to both break through this linear fixation, hunting research and publishing, whilst highlighting possibilities for change, where we can conceptualize iterability as a practice of both repetition and difference. On the one hand, of course, iterability or iteration as a concept can be used to describe the established practices of knowledge production that we as scholars iteratively and often uncritically reproduce. But beyond the creative and critical potential that can lie in repeating practices, iteration as a concept also allows for the emergence of difference. So if we look closer at Derrida's definition of iterability in signature, event, and context, for example, following the logic of repetition, iter means again. But iter also implies change, where itera means other in Sanskrit. So iterability thus implies repetition, but it also alters, where alterity or differentiality can only be defined through its relation to repetition. So for Derrida, the two are interdependent, where repeatability and alterity together form iterability. And here then lies the opportunity for change within our iterative scholarship and publishing practices. For example, a publication existing in different material forms is both a repetition of the same text or content, as well as an altered version of what it repeats or copies. So for Derrida, it's in the repetition of the same that the possibility of something new resides, what he calls the invention of the other. So with this in mind, we can repeat our scholarly practice differently, making iterability into an emancipatory concept through which we can change and intervene through our publishing practices within retaining socio-cultural formations. But we can go beyond iterability or iterative publishing as constituting simply a different written or even material form of an authorial text here. Where for Euro McGann, for example, a specific performance or reading of a text also forms a further iteration of it. And our own interpretations or analysis of a text as scholars can again form a further iteration. So for McGann then, texts are not things or objects, but they are processual events. Every version of reading of a text is a performative as well as what he calls a deformative act, where it further impacts the meaning of the text under analysis, again breaking down the linearity implied in, for example, versioning, where the meaning or impact of a specific version can retrospectively change based on a certain analysis or response to it. So McGann therefore argues for a different dynamic engagement with text, not focused on discovering what a text is, but on an, as he argues, analysis that must be applied to the text as it is performative. Hence, as it keeps on changing in different contexts. So this includes taking into consideration the specific material iteration of the text one is studying, and how this functions, as Catherine Hales has argued, as a technotext. In other words, how its specific material apparatus produces the work as a physical artifact, next to the awareness of how the scholar's textual analysis is itself part of the iteration and authoring of the text. And connected to this, we have to be aware of how the text performativity shapes and influences us as the scholars analyzing it too. Okay, so taking this theoretical exploration of versioning and iteration as a kind of background, I want to explore two projects that have directly experimented with versioning and iteration. So the first one, this is Living Books About Life, which was a groundbreaking series of open access books about life, which was designed to provide kind of a bridge between the humanities and the sciences. And it was published by Open Humanities Press from 2011 onwards. Now, all the books in this series repackage existing open access science-related research, and they supplement this with an original editorial essay to kind of tie the collection together. So this project was designed to, among other things, challenge the physical and conceptual limitations of the traditional codex by including multimedia material, from videos to podcasts, and even whole books inside the living books. But also by emphasizing the book's duration by publishing using an open source wiki platform. So these books are themselves a living collaborative endeavor, open on a read-write basis to add to, edit, annotate, translate, and remix. So wikis as a tool, a technology, or a platform, they offer the potential to question and critically engage issues of authorship, work, and stability. It can offer increased accessibility and induce participation from contributors outside of our often closed academic circles. However, the MediaWiki software employed by Living Books About Life project, in common with a lot of wiki software, keeps accurate track of which user is making what changes. Now, this again offers us the possibility to other users or bots to monitor recent changes to pages, to explore a page revision history, and to examine all the contributions of a specific user. So this kind of wiki software already has mechanisms written into it to manage or fix instances of the text and its authors, by keeping a kind of concise track record or archive of all the changes that are made. But the Living Books About Life project also enforces stability and fixity by clearly mentioning the specific editor's name underneath the title of each collection, instead of like what we discussed earlier, maybe naming all the kind of different people involved in it. But they also have this kind of the book's title page. So by adding a kind of a fixed and frozen version of the text in PDF format, preserving the collection as it was originally created by the editors, but also by binding the book together by adding a cover page. So you saw that in the previous image. Let me see if I can get that back. So this looks like books, right? Yeah. So it's kind of following this rather conventional book structure, complete with a kind of an editorial introduction, followed by thematic sections of curated materials. It kind of mirrored the physical materiality of the book in its design, layout, and structuring in such a way as also reproduces its kind of aura of the book, including the idea of scholarship as stable and fixed, with the clear authority this brings with it. Now, this might explain partly why all the potential of this project notwithstanding, it was like in 2011, so this really was quite a new thing at that point. So the user interaction with the books in the series has been limited in comparison with some other wikis, which are perhaps more clearly perceived as multi-authoring environments. Now here the choice to recut the collected information as a book with clear authors and editors, whilst as a part of rethinking and reperforming the book as concept and form, might paradoxically have been responsible for both the success and the limitations of the project, where these choices meant the project had to conform again to some of the same premises it initially set out to question and critique. The second project I want to discuss is a special edition that we've edited collaboratively with our colleagues from the Disruptive Media Learning Lab. And this is the Journal of Media Practice, and we did a special issue called the Disruptive Journal of Media Practice. Now, what we wanted to do is we wanted to experiment with how media practice, which is a form of practice-based research, so think filmmakers and photographers, for example, how media practice in rethinking research as practice could also be involved in disrupting the way that we mediate this research through various formal and informal scholarly forms, including the academic journal. So we ask ourselves, like, what could a journal of media practice be that moves beyond the collection of standard, single-authored, linear, 8,000-word journal articles, which continues to dominate the field, as well as the journal of media practice itself, which up to then was predominantly filled with practitioners writing mainly text-based articles about their practice or projects, instead of thinking of how they could make publishing part of their practice or part of the performance of their practice. So we asked, how is media practice disruptive of and reperforming the way that we do scholarly communication? Now, within the context of the UK, this again also has to be considered in the light of method-driven research evaluation frameworks, such as the Research Excellence Framework, or the REF in particular. So in principle, this framework, the REF, is agnostic where it concerns the form of a research output. However, universities tend to tailor their submissions to the kind of research they think the expert panels can readily quantify. So for example, research outputs in the form of a single-authored article are readily accepted, but the more fluid and collaborative work of editing and community building is ineligible, discouraging scholars from taking up these important contributions as research. So what we kind of wanted to do is to envision the journal itself as an output of creative conception and production, which showcases the various forms that practice-based research can potentially take, while at the same time emphasizing that this research can be of equal quality, as well as being just as rigorously reviewed as more traditional text-based articles. So that's a little bit the context of what we wanted to do. We wanted to have it something that's also kind of esteemed in that sense. Now, the way that we conceptualize these special issues is that it was structured around a series of curated conversations to emphasize the evolving and collaborative nature of the research. So the articles around which these conversations have centered, they openly evolved from drafts to final versions and beyond on a custom-designed platform that we build, as well as on participants' own websites and servers or on external multimedia platforms. Now, we built this platform based on the requirements of our participating researchers, enabling a range of options for multimodal and processual content. And the submissions around which our conversations were centered are multimodal, text-based or hybrids, both processual and collaborative. I think I go too far. So yeah, the other one, right? So for example, we had a podcast about podcasting, a scalar publication about practice-based research methods, but also an article written in the margins of the project it described. And I forgot an image of that one. So the conversations were enabled and structured with the help of the hypothesis annotation plugin, which allowed comments directly in the margins of the projects themselves. So using custom-designed tags, for example, #DisruptiveJournal, we were able to set up a live feed of the comments as they developed around the content, both on and off platform, providing a live feed and timeline of the combined conversations on the platform around a certain topic. So we also custom designed the hypothesis feed in such a way that all comments came in chronologically, so the last first, instead of as a kind of nested replies to earlier comments, which is how normally the interface of hypothesis works. Now, reflecting on that, and I talked about this during the panel too, overall, this process was a kind of a mixed success. It took a long time to get the authors to all learn and use hypothesis, and authors with a larger online community or those already familiar with the software were able to gather more engagement with their projects than those for whom it was all new. So this whole process of kind of having this conversation around the content lasted a few months, after which we arranged a formal open peer review process, again via hypothesis, for those submissions of which their authors felt that they were ready to be published. So some of the contributors on the platform opted out of this part of the process, for example, because they felt their content needed further development, because remember, we started from drafts, so we didn't really start from full-blown articles. So in practice, many reviewers and reviewees also had various offline conversations via email or other forms of communication. And one of the reviews for the contribution submitted by the cinematologists, which was in the form of a podcast, was similarly recorded as a podcast review and was subsequently mixed into the cinematologist's final submission for this special issue. Now, next to the version of this special issue that's available on the platform, the journal editor and Taylor and Francis, the publisher, insisted that we also create a fixed version of record, both in print and in a hyperlinked PDF available on the Taylor and Francis website. So where the platform version of this special issue had relatively few boundaries concerning length, form, and development of the submissions, the print version forced us to rethink then again what a disrupted journal of media practice might be, given the constraints of the print medium as well as the publisher's guidelines. So what we did is we custom designed the print edition together with the designer and our authors, creatively responding to the specific affordances of their projects, where the authors were asked to think about how they would like to see their contributions, which were developed on that platform, then again translated into a print environment. So this did lead to some really interesting decisions. For example, in the print and the PDF version, the podcast submission was represented by just a simple QR code which linked back to the online version. So that's the only thing that's in the actual print journal. And for the publication that was written in the margins in a nested way, the designer reproduced this layered aspect using markers and difference in font sizes in the print version. However, it was quite interesting to observe how the authors seemed to refer to more traditional forms of writing, where most of them referred to simply writing up a text-based version of their online, more experimental submission. So they kind of went back again, oh, I need to create something print-based, let's just write up a version. So although the print or the Taylor and Francis PDF is a kind of version of records, this special issue encompasses all these online and offline versions. So with this focus on the processual nature of the research, we wanted to challenge this focus on the publications of fixed and finalized object and commodity, which, especially in the context of practice-based research, really does not reflect this kind of research process. So through this experiment in editing, curating, designing, and perhaps most importantly, community building, we wanted to create an environment which both supported and stimulated the various forms in which media practice can be published, whilst collaboratively developing both the platform, the content, and the projects. Okay. Now, for the final part of my talk, I want to move beyond the digital in a different way, where most commonly we look at the implications or possibilities of the digital for doing research or for publishing our research, or even for creating international and cross-disciplinary knowledge communities. However, what I want to highlight here is the crucial role that the digital has also played in creating new collectivities and form of organization around scholar publishers through open access publishing and process of infrastructuring. And so in this sense, I would like to highlight how, for me, a post-humanities method or approach also asks how our scholarship might circulate in new ways, not only in terms of format, but also with respect to distribution systems. So just to recap a little bit, the motivations underlying open access and the reasons to experiment with alternative forms of open academic publishing are various and diverse. So some people see open access as a system to promote innovation and transparency of research, supporting the knowledge economy by making access to information more efficient and cost-effective. So others might, as we discussed in the panel today, see it as an inherently post-colonial project, maximizing the impact of the global north on the global south. Yet many also see it as a movement and a practice that has the potential to critique the increasing marketization of higher education and scholarly publishing, and to potentially make publishing more equitable. Indeed, many experiments with radical open access in digital publishing offer affirmative and practical alternatives through their simultaneous uptake, critique, and experimentation with openness. So mostly academic-led and centered, these experiments with making research available in open access, with processual and multimodal formats, and with the establishment of new alternative institutions and practices, actively critique and pose an alternative to the increasing commercialization of publishing. So the Radical Open Access Collective, which was set up in 2015, is a community of scholar-led, not-for-profit presses, journals, and other open access projects. So the collective promotes a progressive vision for open access based on mutual alliances between the 60+ member presses and projects seeking to offer an alternative to legacy models of publishing. So based on the kind of contingent and diverse philosophy of radical open access, the Radical Open Access Collective means to work towards a framework of resilience, of strength in diversity and in numbers. Now, radical open access as a kind of philosophy does not stand in opposition to open access or even to more neoliberal forms of open access. It's more a kind of repositioning of open access, bringing it in line again with what I would say are its roots, with how it was initially conceived by academics and librarians. Where open access has always been about rethinking scholarly communication and critiquing the hegemonic role of exorbitant profits of commercial presses. It's a response to an uptake of open access in which it is positioned as merely another potentially profitable business model. So radical open access seeks to push back against the dominance of these kind of market-driven versions in order to promote non-commercial and not-for-profit scholar-led approaches to publishing. As such, radical open access positions open access as an affirmative and ongoing critical project. So it's not one thing, it's not a model, it's also not a kind of overarching project, a specific philosophy or a set of principles. It consists of various groups, peoples, institutions, and projects with their own affordances. It embraces experimentation with academic publishing and writing, with the form, content, and process of academic knowledge production. It involves a recognition and nurturing of underrepresented cultures of knowledge, from para-academics to precarious scholars and academics from the global south. And the projects experimenting with these more radical forms of open access tend to envision their publishing outlook with and as part of a relational ethics of care, recognizing that we have a responsibility to all those involved in the publishing process. So these more relational notions of publishing challenge the calculative logic underlying more neoliberal versions of open access. So this is also visible through the sharing within this community of resources, information, skills, and time, building up the kind of collaborative communal knowledge that is already available within the different publishing projects and gifting this to this community. What you see here, this is the members and part of our information platform. So this website and information platform, which was set up by the Radical Open Access Collective, acts as a kind of showcase for these unique visions of open access, but also hopes to provide information for those interested in starting their own open access project. So the site currently lists resources about the collective, including our philosophy, resources related to scholar-led publishing, and a directory of scholar-led presses. So the information portal on the website provides a curated list of articles on topics related to scholar-led publishing, from publishing tools and funding opportunities for open access books to marketing and editorial advice. The collective also runs a mailing list, which is an informal location for strategizing and discussing specific queries. So the Radical Open Access Collective embodies what Sam Moore and I have characterized as horizontal forms of collaboration, forging alliances between small independent projects. Now, this is an important step in this creating economies of scale and in providing mutual aid and logistical support, shared services and best practices. But what the Radical Open Access Collective also sets out to do is to be a starting point for more kind of vertical or multi-stakeholder collaborations that form another important strategy in making not-for-profit independent publishing more resilient. So this includes collaborations which involve libraries, universities, funding agencies, and infrastructure providers, all with a shared interest in the public value of knowledge. So here I think that there is a scope for thinking of the various not-for-profit entities within scholarly communication as potential community partners in the emerging open commons of academic publishing. So the aim then becomes to realign the existing resources in the system of academic publishing and to direct them to alternative not-for-profit collaborative models instead. So in what ways then will these initiatives be able to become resilient, whilst, as I would call it, kind of scaling small? So the diverse constellations of agencies that have emerged out of these open access publishing experiments in the form of collective publishing cooperatives or purchasing consortia has the potential to further transform academic publishing from not contributing to collective and collaborative ones, but also allows these projects to retain their independence and to honor their not-for-profit character, while providing a scalable publishing model that aligns with the ethos of scholar-led publishing. So here, operating communally might aid in overcoming both structural and strategic disadvantages, while maintaining diversity and providing a framework capable of making publishing more resilient. So one of the main things that supports and underlies this is an active focus on using, building, and sharing open source tools and platforms to make publishing more efficient, to reduce reliance on commercial solutions and intermediaries, and to create cost efficiencies in the system. Think, for example, of the importance of open source software such as open journal systems, and how this has enabled an enormous rise in the establishment of scholar-run journals. So this effort towards resources skills sharing characterizes the larger scholar-led publishing community as a whole, where there's a focus on knowledge sharing overall and on mentoring of smaller or newer initiatives, of co-publishing and community and consortium forming on various levels. And you can see this emphasis on collaboration also in their experiments with publishing models, from the communal editing models favored by the Open Humanities Press and Language Science Press, to a focus on getting the community of readers more directly involved through crowdsourcing and donations, as well as other collaborations and funding arrangements with public, not-for-public institutions, such as libraries and universities, who have similar motivations towards the open dissemination of scholarly content. So I'm kind of interested now how this kind of aligns with the theoretical work that's been going on around infrastructuring. It's a concept from science and technology studies which draws on the work of Susan Lee Starr around collaboratively creating socio-technical mechanisms and structures to support communities, which is an ongoing and fundamentally relational practice in response to changing collective organizations and practices. Now, the newly formed Scholar-led intends to set up and expand exactly these kinds of collaborations and relationships. So a consortium of 6 scholar-led academic book publishers, they aim to together develop new tools, workflows, infrastructures, and processes to support the consortium as well as scholar-led publishing more in general, next to setting up new vertical alliances that will further support not-for-profit publishing more in general. Now the issue is that existing infrastructures for the discovery, distribution, and archiving of books have been designed primarily for commercial, large, non-open access publishers. So this often renders them fundamentally inappropriate for open access content and for small scholar-led publishing initiatives operating independent from large commercial publishers. So what Scholar-led is doing is it's streamlining processes for the creation of metadata for the consortium, and they're looking at better integration of open access titles into library catalogs. What they've also done is they've created an open source collaborative conference practice, or a book stand, basically. And I was going to bring that over, but we didn't manage to do the logistics. But I did bring a small version of the book stand, which is a USB with all the books from within the consortium. So if people have laptops with them, you can come over and just take them all for free. Take them. So yeah, so it's about kind of sharing and kind of marketing each other's content, because there isn't this kind of competitive element that other publishers have. So as such, Scholar-led are working towards a collaborative rather than a competitive ecosystem, with next to stimulating innovation in digital knowledge production, will support Scholar-led presses to scale in a horizontal manner by process of infrastructuring, building alliances with other not-for-profit players, including libraries, universities, and university presses. Yet this isn't simply a kind of project that wants to slot scholar-led presses into existing systems and infrastructures. It wants to turn scholar-led publishing to just another publishing model and integrate it into existing systems. Scholar-led aims to thoroughly rethink these systems and how they currently function. So what is needed to enable this is first and foremost a reimagining of what academic collectivity, community, and commonality is and could be in digital publishing environments. So basically, new forms of collaboration need to be imagined. So reimagining the relations within the publishing system beyond the mere calculative logic, focus on assessing the sustainability of alternative models, is essential in a not-for-profit open access publishing environment, in order to enable new forms of collaboration and to redefine the future of digital scholarly publishing in communal settings. Thank you.
We still have around 10 minutes for discussion and questions.
Me again. Don't worry, I won't ask the same question as earlier. Thanks so much for your talk. I enjoyed that immensely. And I just wanted to ask one question, which is that especially when you were talking about versioning or iterating, pardon me, processual publishing, and then also talking about scholar-led, I definitely see the benefit for the academic world that you're talking about, and I'm 100% behind you here. I'm just wondering if you have theorized and thought through potential for public engagement through versioning, or if you see this as benefiting the academic ecosystem exclusively.
Yeah, that's a really good question, thank you. I guess it depends a little bit on where you start from, because I think at the moment we're seeing public engagement as something that happens after we published. So this idea is, oh, we have something that's now done, and at that point we start to promote or brand it, and that's when presses come in, right? They kind of do that dissemination aspect of us. So in that sense, yeah, if we start to think about processual publishing, then this element of it becomes part of it already. And to be honest, I think you're right. I mean, in that sense, this works quite well in the idea of settings of small communities. So the idea is then much more like, oh, instead of focusing on this one object that we create as an author, we start to think a little bit more about how we do research within communities and how we can kind of develop research together. But these elements of kind of disseminating it then to the kind of wider audience or readership that you normally would get with like an output, because of course, mostly when you, as a scholarly work, a lot of the people in your close-knit communities are already aware of your research, they've seen it in conferences, and it's about at that point kind of reaching out a little bit wider, right? So yeah, I think we do need to start thinking if we want to do this model that works a little bit more towards versioning, for example. And I'm not saying that this is something that we need to do. It's just something that I'm experimenting with and I'm interested in. And what does it mean to rethink the book like that? I do think that puts another burden maybe on people about how do we do that promotion. And maybe that's also kind of an essential aspect of what a publisher still does. In whatever point they come in, you know, they do still do that job for us. And I do think that they're really important in this ecosystem. And that's also why, you know, I'm not somebody who is against publishers, because a lot of people, we get a lot of slack from university presses and from traditional presses who say, like, publishing is a job. You know, it's a profession, and academics can't do that. And I'm just like, well, we're not saying that it's not a job or it's not an important thing and a skill that needs to be done. What we want to focus on is that scholars actually become a little bit more aware of this aspect of research, instead of like kind of completely outsourcing it and seeing it as something, oh, that will a publisher start to do. So I hope that answered your question a bit.
Yeah, just a sort of provocative question. So as a media scholar, when I listen to what you're saying, I just think of Richard Barbach and the idea of the Californian ideology, that when we think of Airbnb, when we think of many platforms that begin with a model of community sharing, end up becoming profit monopolies, globalized profit monopolies. And it's particularly complex in the academic sense, because what you're dealing with are institutions that used to be supported by states and are still, but are more and more dependent on markets. So that's another complexity to the arrangement. But what's your comment? Do you think these types of scholarly free cooperations could end in the same way as Airbnb?
No, it is a big risk, you know. But I think basically what the focus is on, because we had a whole discussion about academia.edu, for example, this afternoon, and how they do that, right? They kind of use the kind of value that we put in around the work around research. So you put your publication in and they kind of mine all the data and the metrics and the stuff that we do around that. So it's not like a free platform. It's actually something that makes money off what we do. So I think that a lot of people within these kind of settings that I've been talking about, they also look a lot at licensing and about, for example, at copyleft licensing. So looking at, okay, if you want to reuse this material, it needs to be, you know, reusable again. It needs to be not for profit. It needs to be, so the emphasis here is on creating a commons. And of course, still you can extract from that, but we're trying to do something that if you're giving your labor at least, and if you're investing in these kind of systems, do it for the common good and not for some kind of, you know, Airbnb or academia.edu. And it doesn't mean there will always be free riders. I mean, this is the ongoing issue that we have, and there's no solution to that. But I think at the moment we're spending a lot of our academic free time on kind of sustaining these very commercial systems that just feed off of us. And I think we need to start doing this differently. We need to start rethinking this. And this is an effort, you know, it's one next to others that I think is quite essential. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for bringing up these important issues and raising them in such an enthusiastic and enthusing way. And I wonder what you think of the minimal computing approach that says, in order to reclaim the means of production, as you also argue we should also reduce the level of technical complexity, the depth of the software stack involved, probably forego any notion of online platforms and only share it on the USB drive that you brought with you. And yeah, could you comment on this sort of approach?
Well, that's a really good one.
What do you think of that?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I think I haven't made my mind up on that one. I mean, one of the things we actually did with the Disruptive Journal of Media Practice, I know I presented it as a platform, as something like really cool, but it's actually a really simple WordPress install. And one of the reasons that we did that was that we actually wanted to show people, like, look, this all looks quite fancy, and ooh, a scalar publication and a podcast, but actually the technology underneath that is incredibly simple, and anybody with a server and, you know, a WordPress install can actually do that kind of work. And I work with a lot of colleagues who do this minimal computing, but I think they do it in a different way, in the sense that they are really focused on education. So it's about learning software, about learning the minimal aspects of coding, so breaking it down to elements and then teaching each other to do that as part of as doing research. So this kind of extends the argument that I'm making around publishing, but then about, oh, okay, if we're going to do digital work, maybe we also need to learn at least the minimal basics of that, even as somebody who doesn't normally involve itself in like digital humanities work. But beyond that, I do think that there is an argument to be made for things to be complex. You know, sometimes we need complexity to make a certain argument. Sometimes we want to experiment with more difficult kind of things, and there needs to be place for that too. And that comes back to the whole discussion around open access too, I think, like, oh, how accessible are you actually making it when it's so hard to duplicate? So yeah, I don't have an answer for it, but I don't want to dismiss, I don't want to go towards an either or, I think, in my answer.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really thought-provoking. I wanted to situate the question in the space of an academic in precarity. And I'd like to ask, to what extent does disruption of a publication platform, it's a little bit like the question about Uber, but to what extent inside the university and the committees that make decisions on people and positions and labs and ref, etc., to what extent does disruption sacrifice people, or does it potentially sacrifice people? The only reason I'm asking is that, like, when I encounter this all the time, and I think academia, I think the vision you're providing is extraordinary, but when I walk back into the hallways, right, those hallowed hallways of academia, it's one of the most slow-moving conservative spaces I can possibly imagine, where disruption is a cool title of an article, but in praxis, like in forms of objects, seems to be potentially alienating. You know, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about, like, is there can we cultivate a disruption prestige, right? Can we find a space? I mean, what is it that you do to clear the space for a safe, right, and inclusive disruptive model?
Well, Actually, I'm now in the Center for Post-Digital Cultures, but a previous iteration of the center was the Center for Disruptive Media, so we have thought about that issue quite a lot. And I think it depends a little bit on, because we kind of rephrase this whole idea of disruption as it comes from within the tech world, you know, that it's basically more of an economic model in which you kind of completely break down one business model to, you know, kind of give room for a new one. And for us, it's more in that sense around, sometimes you do need to kind of upset existing ways of doing things and kind of try out something completely different to reassess that. And so in that sense, I get your question. I completely get your question about, oh yes, what do we do with, for example, precarious laborers? What do we do with people who could be upset by these kind of changes? And I think that's a kind of, that's where the politics actually lies in these kind of questions. Like, what kind of decisions do you make? Because on the one hand, I do think that sometimes we just need to be, that was my phone, we need to kind of shake up systems and say to management and stuff, no, we're going to do it differently. No, we don't want to use your commercial repository anymore. We're going to boycott this or whatever. But sometimes we also need to go back to that ethics of care and thinking about the relationalities, about kind of who are we going to upset? Is this going to be complicated for the people that rely on this system? So this is a kind of a question that I think we have to ask ourselves all the time. And I think that specific points ask for more disruption than other ones. So I always see this as kind of picking your battles. So for me, my specific battle is this, you know, it's trying to reform scholarly publishing. And I'm trying to do that in a way that's both disruptive or that's actually trying to really posit an alternative, you know, something that for a lot of people see like, I think people must remember here in the room that when open access was first presented as a model, people were like, this is ridiculous, this is never going to work, this is a dream, this is a utopia, you know. But actually we can sometimes posit these kind of weird experimental new things to just try them out. And yeah, so that's what I'm trying to do in hopefully a way that won't upset too many people. And for me, it's also, you know, it's not about experimentation, it's about thinking through something that just works better for us, that starts from the question like, what do we want and what do we need? And how have we actually come to this kind of weird predicament in which we write these still like, print-based things, and we're actually still giving all our money to commercial publishers. This is just something, how did we end up here? Maybe we do need to kind of just cut that down and start anew.
Just a quick question. Publishing is indeed a separate job, and I think it's really difficult to be an academic and to be a publisher at the same time. So wouldn't that lead to creation of alternative publishing, essentially, which will require, again, the publishers. So the academics who have to become publishers in order to publish for other academics at the expense of doing their own academic work. So that's, I mean, that's kind of like a danger that seems to be coming up from pushing too much toward that direction, even though I'm fully for that.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be feeding commercial publishers, of course.
So my response to this question, because I do get this quite a lot, also from publishers who kind of push it in that way, but my answer to that is that actually we already do so much publishing. We just do it for free, and at the moment we're not kind of recognizing it. Like the peer reviewing we do, the sitting on editorial boards, that is publishing too, you know, it's part of it. And of course, for me the argument is more that I want to see publishing as something that we see more as, we include it as something that is part of the research process. It's not something that somebody else does. And I think this is something that we need to rethink both as academics, but universities need to start seeing this as something like, oh, okay, you know, let's imagine a system in which everybody gets a day a week to actually do editorial work or to do publishing work. And even then, like that's a weird utopian system that I'm kind of thinking of now, but you could imagine that there's just like what now with these groups of scholar-led publishers, and there's a growing group of people in kind of communication studies that are doing this kind of alt-ac work within universities. So next to having a university job, they're spending, you know, their time that other people would work on digital humanities work or on editorial boards for learned societies. They're doing that to put it into publishing work. And I think that the second answer is that actually, what I try to show is that actually by combining a lot of small entities together and by doing small pieces of work together. So I really like what Language Science Press, for example, I don't know if you know them, they have set up this model in which they kind of have a pool of about 300 linguists who all do a little bit of work towards publishing process. And so in that end, if you've got 300 people working on a book, actually the amount of time that people spend is not that much. And it's actually quite doable to do publishing in that way. This is not going to replace publishing. It's just a kind of an alternative model, a kind of supplementary model that we could, I hope, slowly start to introduce a little bit more.
I have the mic, so it's my question. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm completely biased and disposed to agree with everything you've said, but I want to ask a question that asks for a bit more about what you didn't say. Would that be okay? I'm thinking particularly of the Changing Publishing Ecologies report, acknowledging, as you have I think throughout, that there are these ecologies that we need to pay attention to. No person, no even single group of people doing the same thing stand alone in transformation and disruption. There has to be a larger movement. And it's one that can involve academic presses here, or not. Certainly involves scholar-led groups, or not. Policymakers, or not. Government funders, or not. And so on. It's really just a big group. And so thinking about that report then, Changing Publishing Ecologies, in that report, use it as an opportunity to speak not only about a vision of the landscape, which you've kindly laid out here amongst doing much more, but you also made recommendations.
Yeah.
And I feel that they're good recommendations, but I'm wondering if you'd care, I feel, maybe because I'm biased, maybe because I'm not, but I'm wondering if you'd care to talk about how you feel those recommendations have been implemented and heard.
So yes, this is a report that I wrote for JISC, which is basically a kind of a mapping of this landscape. So yeah, so this kind of scholar-led publishing model, especially when it comes to books, because for journals it's been a longer thing, but especially for books, that's what I looked at, these kind of presses that have come up, mostly in the UK and US context. And what we're kind of looking at was, what is this model? So yeah, so kind of how does it differ from, let's say, a university press? And what are its needs and why did it kind of come into being? So what came out of this report is that most of these presses are basically just small communities of scholars, that start to work together. It could be around a journal, like Meta Journal, for example, but this is done in the case around books, about creating books. And a lot of them are actually like really small projects, so maybe projects that create 1 or 2 books a year, And you could say maybe that in a way like, oh, okay, well, how does that differ then from a university press? Because you've got a lot of small university presses too, but a lot of the kind of scholar-led presses felt that they didn't fit within that landscape because increasingly, and I think we had the lady from AUB here, you're in these kind of commercial settings as a university press too. So for a lot of people who wanted to do stuff that was a bit more experimental or open access, they felt that, we can't really be in these environments either. So we're just going to set up these kind of, we're going to set up something for ourselves. So the issue is though that it's incredibly labor intensive work. And this is also, most of these presses have been led by incredibly energetic people, like 1 or 2 people who, even though they're behind them, there's a whole community of people. You need to have somebody who goes and say, I want to do this, and I'm going to invest a substantial amount of time in it. The issue is that, of course, is not a sustainable model. It won't be a sustainable model, And so the recommendations for within that kind of report that I did focus on ways that we can actually work towards that more sustainability. And so one of the ways that we want to do that is by really making an appeal to funders and to universities and to libraries to start supporting this kind of work, because at the moment they're kind of outsourcing this to commercial publishers, and it's really, you can start to stimulate this in very simple ways by just giving your academics a little bit more time, or by creating these kind of infrastructures, what we've been talking about too. And so, for example, that's what Scholar-led is really trying to do. They're trying to create a kind of infrastructure that people, other presses can use, that scholars can use to easily set up small projects like this that don't have to be like massive presses, but that just publish a few books a year, for example. And trying to find out where these kind of impediments lie, and trying to find out where these barriers towards setting up these kind of things. And there are many, that's unfortunately the case. So the recommendations kind of focus on that, like how can we move that forward? So yeah, I hope that kind of, or was there a specific thing that you still wanted me to focus on? No?
Yeah, are there any more questions? I can see not. So thank you again, Janneke, for this talk.